2021 was another turbulent year in video games. We really started to see the effects of 2020 on game development, with a slew of delays pushing titles back into 2022, the first quarter of which has become incredibly crowded. That being said, there were still a ton of fantastic games this year, and given that my plate was generally pretty full of stuff to play throughout the year, I selfishly am somewhat happy there weren't more great games stacked on top of 2021. I had absolutely no trouble putting together my annual collection of top 10 games and had to make some hard cuts in several places. So without further delay, let's take a look at my 10 favorite games of 2021. In the lead up to its launch, I fully expected the Switch re-release of Super Mario 3D World to be a fully competent port, and for Bowser's Fury to be a fun new set of levels. But what we actually got in Bowser's Fury was a reinvigorating new look at a franchise that has been around for a very long time. Instead of being a hub world from which you would venture out to individual levels, every level in Bowser's Fury is contained within a single large world, where you can travel back and forth between them at will. It certainly has its rough edges, the most glaring of which being the rate that Bowser interrupts your progress, especially towards the end of the game. But the core concept it experiments with over its relatively short runtime, that of a single large open world in which Mario's adventures take place, is one that I hope will blossom into an incredible full game of its own sometime in the future. I have really enjoyed each successive entry in the Hitman reboot trilogy, and this year's Hitman 3 was no exception. Granted, just like previous games, there were bad levels, good levels, and ones that lay in between, but I still felt that not only was playing through those levels the first time a lot of fun, but the game contained more than enough things to do when going back to those levels, in some cases changing how the levels played entirely. I will also concede that giving Hitman 3 a slot on this list is not just an endorsement of the third game in this series, but of the great job it does of bringing together the levels of the entire trilogy into a single game, creating an incredible new platform for everything Hitman in the foreseeable future. Something that they already seem set to expand on in 2022, and I could not be more excited for it to come. In the last decade or so, I've fully fallen in love with all kinds of roguelikes, and I've played a massive number of them. But I've never played anything quite like Returnal. For starters, the huge budget this game clearly got makes it absolutely graphically stunning. A game that holds up to scrutiny in its position as a flagship PS5 exclusive. But even more importantly than that, it has third-person shooter gameplay that also sticks to the strengths of the game's developer, Housemarque, creator of several incredible bullet hell games over the years. Returnal manages a faithful replication of their trademark bullet hell style and seamlessly merges its three disparate influences, third-person shooter, roguelike, and bullet hell shooter, into a single game that can be extremely challenging as well as extremely rewarding. Returnal was one of those games I picked up, started playing, and didn't put back down again until I was done. One thing that independent games do incredibly well is fill gaps in the games being released that have been left open by major AAA game development, moving on to fresher, more big-budget pastures. The side-scrolling platformer, for example, has almost exclusively become the realm of independent game developers. These games also often seamlessly blend the core gameplay loops of classics while implementing brand new concepts from modern game development. And this is exactly what Death's Door does. At its very core, Death's Door is an old-school top-down Zelda game. This goes beyond mere appearances as you begin to pick up different power-ups like bombs and a hook shot and venture into pretty clearly delineated dungeons with your sword and bow. The game also wears its modern influence on its sleeve, carrying forward a strong Souls-like influence from the developer's previous title, Titan Souls, but less in the form of any sort of extreme difficulty, especially not on the level of Titan Souls, and more in terms of structure, with planting seeds in pots standing in for bonfires, and the game still heavily focused around big bosses that reward souls to be exchanged for ability enhancements at a vendor. This all comes together to make a singular, fantastic game that brings the top-down Zelda style into the next generation. Over the years, a lot of developers have made a lot of different Dungeons & Dragons video games, as well as some being based on other major tabletop gaming properties like Pathfinder. But most of those games aim to make traditional RPGs, where the game master, as they were, are the developers of the game, failing to empower players beyond just control of their individual character stories, which is still a really good thing to do, and there have been exceptions, like the extensive system that Neverwinter Nights had for building your own adventures, your own stories, being your own game master. But none of those games in the past have made it as easy as Wildermyth does, with a simple text-based campaign editor that makes it incredibly easy to create your own campaigns from scratch. And all this talk about creating your own worlds is not to discount what the base game can do without any of this. Even with the built-in campaigns, you get plenty of branching choice, your own developments to your own randomly generated characters, who will slowly generate new nuances to their own characters, to their own lives. And you'll have some amount of choice in that as well. What's going to happen to these characters as they go on? What sort of things they may develop as new quirks or abilities. And the combat is no slouch either. An excellent turn-based strategy game that has just the right balance of classes and enemy types to keep it fun. Wildermyth is a fantastically built turn-based strategy RPG with a great storytelling community that might manage to keep it alive indefinitely, and it's been an enormous amount of fun to keep playing. Before Your Eyes is an incredibly moving game. One of the most emotional things I've played in years. On the surface, it seems like any other sort of, emotional story-based indie game that you'd see, but where its real impact comes from is its innovative control mechanic. You hook up a webcam to your computer, and when you blink, the game progresses to the next vignette. But as long as you don't blink, you can continue to watch the story play out in front of you. You can also kind of move the camera around, point it at different places in the environment, and then blink so that you can get more detail or see more things. However, while blinking is your primary form of control, as we all know, blinking is also inherently outside of your control. You can choose to blink, but you can't always choose not to blink. And as Before Your Eyes goes on and continues to emotionally weigh on you more and more, it takes advantage of the fact that it's definitely getting harder and harder to not blink until you get to one of the final scenes in the game where you just can't help but to blink almost nonstop, no matter how much you might want to let the scene continue. It's an incredibly powerful moment that I've almost experienced nothing like in games. Before Your Eyes has an incredibly well-written story and has leveraged this new control method in a way that engages the player in an entirely novel method of control that just makes it so much more involving and emotional. It may not be at the absolute top of my list, but I cannot express enough how much I believe everyone should play Before Your Eyes. Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker is a game that finds other ways to pummel your emotions. I only just started playing during Stormblood, but I've still invested hundreds of hours into the game's world, grown to know and love this entire cast of characters, and practically anything they do with that game and its cast is going to do something to me emotionally. And thankfully, Endwalker did some really great things once again. As far as I'm concerned with regards to the main story quests, Endwalker is the best they've done yet, with plenty of fantastic moments and an effective wrapping up of a large number of the game's storylines that have been ongoing since A Realm Reborn launched in 2013. While enough threads have been left dangling to continue on with more expansions, I left Endwalker's story feeling incredibly satisfied with where the world was and what my character has managed to achieve in it. And like any MMO, I'm going to spend hundreds of more hours with Endwalker before the next expansion comes out, but when it comes to ranking it in my top 10 list, I don't even care about that. For the main story quests alone, Endwalker sits here as my number 4. And while that's certainly due to just the sheer amount of time that Final Fantasy XIV has had to build up emotional impact in my mind, it's still something I never would have expected any MMO to have been able to do even just a few short years ago. I'm probably speaking for a lot of people when I say I thought Psychonauts 2 was not going to be a game we ever actually got. Even after Double Fine announced it was coming, I was skeptical about the quality of game they were going to deliver. They had never managed to hit the highs they hit with that first Psychonauts ever since its release. With Psychonauts 2, that's all changed. It reveres the original just enough while also dragging all of its concepts into the modern day. I still have some minor quibbles with how it controls in combat, but as with a lot of Double Fine games, the writing and the characters shine so brightly that they overshadow those small issues I have. The comedy is great, but they've also done a surprisingly deft job at creating a game about jumping into people's minds and looking at their trauma. It knows exactly how to treat mental illness with the reverence it deserves and to speak up to the real harm it causes people, while also still maintaining that trademark Double Fine humor that was so pervasive throughout all of their games. It even expands on the Psychonauts lore in some pretty huge ways, both for the organization as well as Raz himself. If this is what we can expect from a financially unrestricted Double Fine, I am very excited to see what the future holds. In a year absolutely packed to the brim with time loop games, The Forgotten City shines the brightest by far. Both Deathloop and 12 Minutes, games with far more attention at the start of the year, and in Deathloop's case, infinitely more money, came nowhere near what The Forgotten City has built in terms of time looping. Granted, this game had a bit of a head start given its roots as an acclaimed Skyrim mod, but what they managed to achieve here is still massive. Everything in this game was built thinking about what players want out of a time loop game, from the way that the base mechanic works, to the way that the looping is triggered, to even the way that the game builds shortcuts into its narrative structure so you don't have to do every little thing during every loop where you want to reach the same point. The game only gates you by knowledge and a few items, to the point where if you know exactly what you're doing, you can beat the game in only 2 runs. And that's what I want a time loop game to be ultimately. I want to be in control of what I'm doing. I want to at least feel like I'm figuring things out on my own, even though the game is almost certainly quietly guiding me along the path to ensure I don't get frustrated. Not only does Forgotten City absolutely nail every last one of those things, but it also understands its setting in a way that is incredibly rare. From a game that was based on Skyrim and then transitioned into being about Roman society, there's so many tiny little details about the Roman world in here that the game builds into its setting that really make it feel like a place in time and not just a sandbox for a time loop game. I came away from Forgotten City not only stunned at what this team managed to do, but beyond excited to see what they can do next. The reign of the roguelike deck builder has been all but solidified in the last few years with a constant deluge of new releases. And I'm so glad that when I was first introduced to Inscription, I kind of just thought it was one of those with an additional neat escape room thing going on. But, oh boy, this game is so much more, which you'll pretty quickly start finding out. Inscription is a game where I'm going to have to spend a lot of time kind of dancing around my points because I don't want to spoil this game. Because spoiling a lot of the things that happen in this game ruin it. It's about making it through. It's about finding out what happens. But suffice it to say that it's an experience quite unlike anything you've ever had before. If you've played Mullen's previous works, you have some sort of an idea of what's probably going to happen here. If you've played Pony Island or something like that, you kind of know what's probably going to go on. But Inscription really takes it to the next level. The meta-narrative and the different sections of the game are both really great elements, but the parts that really spoke to me, that really made me love this game enough to make it my game of the year, involve the characterization of the characters in the game via the cards. And for certain characters, the way they played those cards. The story has even expanded beyond the game itself and into the real world in some really neat ways. But I think the really important part at the heart of it is it has a fantastic atmosphere, really great writing and characterization, and a reasonably fun card game at the heart of it. The card part does have some weaknesses, and the game does start to fall apart eventually as you gain certain overpowered cards, but the beautiful thing is, that's kind of the point. It's a mechanic so that people who maybe aren't the best at card games or just getting bad luck can still manage to see the rest of the really cool stuff that's in store here.